All righty, folks. What's going on? Joshua here. You know what it is. It's boxing history time because that's what we talk about on this channel. Primarily, I would say. Primarily. Because we talk about some modern stuff as well. But shout out to everyone out there. Appreciate you all. You know, we're back at this thing. And this time it's going to be a pretty special one. All of them are special, really. But this is going to be a special one because it's going to be talking about a fighter who doesn't get mentioned much, actually. And I mean that. I seriously mean that. He does not get mentioned very often. You know, you have to really dive into the depths of history to even know who he is. I've done some diving. Of course, there have been those that have dove further than I. But that being said, I have done some diving, and there are people out there doing some diving right now alongside me as well. So shout out to all those individuals. With that being said, we're going to be talking about a guy by the name of George Budge Byers. Nickname Budge, but George Budge Byers. And he is a fighter from Canada, from the Bog specifically. We're going to talk about all that, what that means, etc. That being said, before we do, just want to send a shout out to all in attendance who will be here listening live, as well as those who will be listening on replay. You know, any listen is a listen worth mention, so you all appreciate it. And of course, you know the routine. Hit that like button. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't subscribed. But ultimately, even if you don't, you are appreciated for just dropping by. Even those that kind of just drop in and they drop right back out, because I can see it popping up there on the screen. Hey, you're appreciated. Even if you're not seeing this, you're appreciated. Shout out to Choice Habit, brought to you by Choice Habit, I will say. That's the company right there. So you see the QR code there on the screen. That is Choice Habit. Be sure to scan that, choicehabit.com. We got all your needs there. When you're talking about it from a media, PR, you're talking about consulting, project management, design, editing, whatever relations, we got that covered. Choice Habit. So we're brought to you by Choice Habit, baby. But salute to everyone. Shout out to my man Rodolfo Rivera Jr. in the mix right here. Rodolfo Rivera Jr., aka El Gato. That's what my man Dan says. Shout out to my man Dan the Man right there. Be sure to check him out, folks. See him there in the profile pic, cooling it with the glasses and all, showing the guns or whatever. I see you there, Dan. I appreciate you there, buddy. Hey, Dan is always in the mix, sharing some good knowledge and all of that stuff when we talk this boxing history stuff. And appreciate you once again being here, Dan, because, hey, you're the man there. So we're talking George Budge Byers, as mentioned. He's probably someone that many don't know, or at least they don't know much about him. They may have heard the name of Canadian fame, as mentioned. Born in the Bog right there. The Bog. That's what I will say. I did not get a chance to look up some stuff I wanted to look at. Well, basically, I wanted to look at the video that I did on George Byers on the channel prior to this. Give me a little bit of a refresher, but I wasn't able to do so. But you know what? That's typically the case because, hey, we go off top right here, baby. I ain't scared. Let's talk about it. We're going to listen. We're going to learn. That's the way it is because people are going to be sharing in the comments. I'm going to be sharing the stuff that I know, and we're all going to gather from this. So let's get it. But yeah, George Budge Byers. I'm going to pull up his card, as a matter of fact, or what I would call a card. I pulled it up a little bit last night as well, so you can see some of those notable fights. One thing to mention, of course, the record 27-20. So that means 20 victories, 7 losses, 20 draws. And he had 3 no contests, 14 knockouts, or 2 no decisions as well, I should note. 2 no decisions thrown in the mix there. Some notable names, of course, Dick Moore, fighting Dick Moore, Jack O'Brien. That Jack O'Brien is the Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. Sandy Ferguson, big. That's his nickname right there. Big Sandy Ferguson, just a big dude. We got Billy Stiff. That's a name you don't hear too often right there. Rugged, tough guy right there. We got George Gardner in the mix right there. If you don't know George Gardner, second ever world light heavyweight champion. We got my man Harry Peppers in the mix right there. I know some of you probably haven't heard of him. Then we got Jack Sullivan. That's Jack Sullivan of Twin Note. That means he has a twin. You probably know his twin, Mike Sullivan. Jack Twin Sullivan and Mike Twin Sullivan. You got Dick O'Brien, a fighting machine who's been in with some of everybody there. I don't know about the relation with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. Could be, could not. I don't know that for sure. Maybe I should look it up. Billy Smith, that is not just any Billy Smith. That is the mysterious one right there, and you'll know about that. Of course, we got the crafty Texan himself, Frank Childs, another one he was in there with. Then we have my man Jack Root, the first ever, I repeat, the first ever world light heavyweight champion. Jack Root there. Then we have, of course, Jack Bonner, who is a heavyweight who was in with pretty much everybody during the era. If you haven't heard the name Jack Bonner, no worries. We'll talk about it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do a video on Jack Bonner because he's just in and out with the who's who of the heavyweight division and around it during his time there in the era. So Jack Bonner, a name you all should certainly know right there. But he was a hell of a fighter right there, hell of a contender. Never won a world title, but he was in the mix with everyone. But we got George Budge Byers, folks. Now, I will note that I mentioned the record 27-20. So you had 20 draws there. I'll repeat this just for those that may be new to it, or at least learning it, knowing it. Sometimes a draw didn't necessarily mean that it actually was contested. It was an even fight where it just went down to the wire and they were like, oh my goodness, I can't pick who the winner was. Sometimes it was just prearranged. You never knew the stipulations there. For instance, there were situations where there would be fights where if X fighter did not knock out their opponent, it would just be a draw. It would just be a draw. Or there'd be fights where it was prearranged that regardless of what happens, the outcome is going to be a draw. You know, you had that type of stuff right there. So you have a multitude of things. Of course, we know draws today. We typically see them when you have scoring situations where it's even or whatnot, but that wasn't necessarily the case back then, though you did have that at times too. But sometimes it came to the decision of the referee, because oftentimes during these periods, there weren't judges just sitting around scoring in a way that we think about it traditionally, or at least what it is now. There were periods in which the referee was the lone decider. So if the referee felt that, hey, this fighter may not have gotten a larger edge versus the other one, then it would be declared a draw. So you have those types of things that are thrown into the mix there. So when you see those 20 draws on the record of George Budge Byers, doesn't necessarily mean it was from the standpoint of just a super competitive fight that was so even and close that a decision couldn't be rendered. Dan mentions, wow, Harry Pepper was a great black fighter. Fought Hugo Kelly a couple of times. Indeed. He was the middleweight champion of the Pacific Coast, if I'm not mistaken. Harry Pepper, as a matter of fact, why not start there? So he was able to knock out Harry Pepper. I'm going to pull up the box rec as well. At least I got it here on my screen. That's probably the first notable fight there on the record of George Byers right there, or at least one of the notable fighters in the sense of names that many will probably be familiar with, or some at least will be familiar with, though there are some others that are in the mix. That's one that I was certainly familiar with, and you probably, and it says middleweight champion of the Pacific Coast there's on box rec at least. So Harry Peppers, he was pretty solid sized guy. If I'm not mistaken, he was around 6 feet tall. And so just think about that, a middleweight. So he had some good size to him. That being said, he wasn't a guy that couldn't be knocked out. That being said, so the bigger they are, the harder they fall. That's a phrase that was coined supposedly by John L. Sullivan. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. That was the case with Harry Peppers right there, because George Budge Byers was able to knock them out. For George Byers, he was about 5'8". You know what I'm saying? 5'7", 5'8" right there. And generally, maybe was in that 150-ish pound range. 150, 160, I guess you can say. Between that 150 and 160, if you were talking about him in his prime, just sharp there, cut, just ready to go, then he was generally in that range. But that being said, he competed at middleweight. And, of course, it varied over the course of years, especially in the early days. You got to think about a guy like George Byers. He started in the 1800s, so that factors in. So middleweight wasn't always 160 pounds. You had situations where to be the middleweight champion, you could have weighed 154 pounds, 152 pounds. So it varied for sure. 158 pounds. It was a situation like that. It's just oftentimes you have guys who are smaller than even that. For instance, Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, first world middleweight champion. He's another one who he was generally in the 150s, and that's what middleweight was competed at, the 150-ish range. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm just thinking, I'm pretty sure there was at least a fight recorded of his where he might have even been in the 140s. It might have been multiple fights where he was in the 140s, but these guys were accustomed to just fighting up. You know what I'm saying? Up. It wasn't a situation where guys were cutting down. In most cases, guys were trying to get up and they weren't actually meeting the actual weight limit, you know? So that's one of the big differences from today. So you have a lot of individuals today, hey, and power to them, they cut down in weight. So they may walk around at 180 pounds and cut down to 160 pounds or something like that. It's not blasphemous. It's not out of the question for things like that to transpire. Shout out to my man, Random Acoustic Thoughts. Big up there to your Random Acoustic Thoughts. Hey, I've said it once. I'll say it again. Random Acoustic Thoughts. That's a channel you want to check out. Random, I don't know what you're up to right now. If you want to come on, you can feel free to do so. Because Random Acoustic Thoughts, he is certainly the man when it comes to Sam Langford, the greatest fighter of all time there, Canadian. Another fighter out of Canada, Sam Langford, the Boston Bone Crusher. And as a matter of fact, the Boston Bone Crusher was trained by the drum roll, of course, and I have the sound effects as well. George Byers, of course. George Byers. So Sam Langford, George Byers has actually trained him. And it's so crazy. I have missed it for countless amounts of times and years, as a matter of fact. But there's a video out there of Sam Langford when he's getting ready to fight Fireman Jim Flynn in one of those contests. But you can actually see George Byers there in the ring with him. I'm sure random news. Shout out to my man Miter Span. He actually put me on game. I had seen this video countless amounts of times, and it just didn't dawn on me. That's George Budge freaking Byers standing there in the ring, right there on camera. I think he was chewing gum. In the lead up to, and as they were getting in the ring, they're getting ready to tee off. That being Sam Langford and Fireman Jim Flynn. If you don't know Fireman Jim Flynn, tough, rugged guy right there. Crazy. That being said, so George Byers was in the ring. So he did do some work as a trainer as well. As a matter of fact, I go over that in the video on the channel, but follow Random Acoustic Thoughts. Dan mentions Bob Fitzsimmons said it, and he sends a regard to Random there. For sure. So be sure to check out Random Acoustic Thoughts. Some great content there, historic content. If you're into boxing history, especially these pugilistic eras, late 1800s, early 1900s, then that's the man right there for you. And he is working on a book, so I will repeat that piece of it. But we're talking George Budge Byers here today, folks. Hey, do me a favor. Once again, hit the like button if you haven't. Some of you, I'm sure you're there. Hit the like button if you haven't, folks. I appreciate it there for sure. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't as well. Well, if you want to. I mean, at the end of the day, I guess you don't have to. Hey, I'll take it regardless of the situation in terms of if you want to just drop by and check them out here and there. Because sometimes I watch some videos and I may not subscribe or whatever. I know it's kind of one of those things, but it's not the end of the world. I will say that. Here, once again, some of his notable fights, and I'm going to go over and make sure this is showing on Facebook because I actually realized that with some of the changes that come about on Facebook and such, the live stream doesn't always show there as I'm live. I have to go and change something. As a matter of fact, a lot of the streams that I have been doing, they actually... it ended up being a situation where I had to go there and change the audience. And when I changed the audience setting, then I guess people could see it then. But they have some little thing that they put in place that really altered it. It used to be a situation where if you just went live here via StreamYard, who I use, StreamYard, hey, great. I've always enjoyed them. I love what they do. They continue to update. But it used to be a situation where you just went live and all was good. But something happened with changes there on the Meta Facebook side to where it only shows, I don't know, to me, I guess, for some reason. So I don't know what it is. Maybe I need to figure that out. I feel I'm savvy technically, and for some reason, I just don't understand why this just does not happen in the way that it should happen. So it is what it is, though. Hey, we're not gonna scream over it because I'm looking in there now. I don't see where I can edit the audience. For some reason, I can't edit the audience right here while I'm live. But hey, it is what it is. YouTube, that's the place to be right here if you want to tune in and learn about some of these individuals that are doing their thing here in the boxing history world. But we're going to get back to George Budge Byers. As I noted, about 5'8", always in impeccable shape, and he got that, likely learned that from a cousin of his. If you didn't know that, and I mentioned it in last night's stream, be sure to go check that out because we were talking about some military veterans. But Old Chocolate George Godfrey, one of the Colored World Heavyweight Champions who held that reign there. I think he was the third ever. I'm pretty sure it was probably the third, somewhere in that range, somewhere third, fourth, somewhere in there. But Old Chocolate George Godfrey, another individual from Canada, from the Bog. And for those that don't know, the Bog is essentially, it's like a slum-like area that was in Canada. It was an area that was, I guess, sort of earmarked in some sense for lower wage population. So it's a mixture. So you had a mixture of black folks, white folks, I'd imagine other ethnicities that were involved there, but they were sort of on the poor side. It was considered to be a slum there in Canada. If you look that up, the Bog, Canada, there are actually some pictures of kind of where it used to be or what used to consist of the Bog, though it's not the same now. That being said, this was the location for which George Budge Byers came about, same with his cousin there, Old Chocolate George Godfrey. Now, the situation at hand was that George Godfrey, like Byers, he ended up immigrating to the United States of America, competing there as a boxer, championship level boxer, Colored World Heavyweight Champion, as I mentioned, would have been someone who was capable of potentially winning the World Heavyweight Championship around that period, though he didn't get a shot at such with John L. Sullivan. The color line is primarily a reason, but there was at least one occasion where both Old Chocolate George Godfrey and John L. Sullivan were down, stripped to their trousers, and they were ready to get it on there in fisticuffs, and it was going to be an actual matchup. And what ultimately transpired was the police stepped in and they stopped it. And I guess you can say the rest is history there because we never got to see that matchup. And then there were some other ones that didn't come about as well. But that being said, it just so happened a lot of these individuals that were from Canada migrated to Boston, that Boston area. Boston is a fight town. Historically speaking, it is a fight town. As a matter of fact, one of the premier fight towns there, just from an overall perspective in the United States, but not just the United States, but North America in general. And when you factor in that particular time period in the world, like if you were making stuff happen, you were doing it in Boston, no doubt about it, during those particular periods. Now, it's kind of fallen off the radar in that sense these days, though boxing does take place, and they have had some sort of high-profile fights over the course of the last several years, or decade or whatever. But that being said, pretty much few and far in between. But back then, that was the place to be there. You had your New York City, that is, of course, and you had the San Francisco, you had your Chicago, you had your Philadelphia, which is always a fight town, premier fight town, still is a fight town. and a number of other places as well. New Orleans, believe it or not, used to be a premier fight town. Not so much now, especially in the time of John L. Sullivan, James J. Corbett. New Orleans, that was the premier spot, or at least one of the premier spots. So right around that time, certainly, of course, Boston, same case. So that's where George Budge Byers ended up going, of course, because he followed his cousin, Old Chocolate, who had went there. And, of course, that eventually is where Sam Langford would eventually go. And Sam Langford, we know what he was able to do there in the sport, regarded as the greatest fighter of all time by many, though some may not consider himself, but certainly one of the greatest fighters of all time. I guess I would put him number one as far as I'm concerned as well, just with what he was able to accomplish. Him and Harry Greb, I mean, interchangeable in some sense there. But that being said, Boston was that place. As a matter of fact, John L. Sullivan, Roxbury, Massachusetts, that's where he's from, or at least born there. His parents came over from Ireland, migrated during the potato famine. Potato famine. Remember the Irish potato famines? Pretty crazy stuff right there. But so it just became one of those popular spots, especially for Irish boxers there. So that's where George ended up going, and that's where he applied his trade. That's where he learned a lot of things. George Godfrey had a gym there, as a matter of fact, in the story that I was sharing. I think I've shared it before. Well, at least I know I've shared it before. Just can't remember on how many occasions and on which streams specifically, but that was a gym where a lot of fighters came through. A lot of black fighters actually came through that gym, as a matter of fact, one of them being Barbados Joe Walcott. So I don't recall the year specifically, but I do mention it in the George Budge Byers video that I have on the channel, which I did share yesterday, as a matter of fact. So if you look at the community post, you'll see it there. But there was sort of a backroom competition that took place, a backroom fight, sort of unsanctioned in the sense of it being a recorded fight. But, hey, they were going, this was a fight. Or you can say it was a sparring session one that was more of an official style, and the understanding is that during that, it was George Byers taking on Barbados Joe Walcott, former world welterweight champion. As a matter of fact, the first black world welterweight champion. And just for those who don't know, and I'll say this just in case you do a quiz or something, Barbados Joe Walcott, originally from Guyana, so he's not from Barbados in that sense in terms of him being born there, born in Guyana, but Barbados Joe Walcott, one of the greatest 5'1", stocky, could punch, powerful, small guy. And in modern times, I kind of associate a guy like Nick Ball with him. If you don't know Nick Ball, he's a fighter out of the UK. He's about 5'1". Sometimes I've seen him listed as 5'2", but he's generally 5'1", and he's a world champion. And of course, pretty much everybody he's been in the ring with is taller than him, which was the case there with Barbados Joe Walcott. And he's found a way to win. He's undefeated. He had a draw in a contest where some think he won that fight, and he could have been a win right there, but he's undefeated, and he has to do it the hard way. He's able to get in there, and he's like a wrecking ball, no pun intended, since his last name is Ball. But that being said, he's able to get in there and apply a lot of damage on the inside, and he's one of those tough and rugged guys, and I imagine you have to be. So when you're tied up and all of that stuff, he's still throwing punches. The referee literally has to get in there and break them up, because he's not going to stop. He's going to keep doing this thing. So, hey, woe is the fighter who chooses to be in there and not kind of throw back at that particular time. But that being said, Ball, man, he's actually he's a wrecking crew in himself, just there being at 5'1", compact. But you can see that he's stocky. He has some power to him, not that one punch knockout power, but he can knock you out, no doubt about it. He can do it through accumulation, and if he catches you the right way, he can get you out of there for sure. So you can tell those punches hurt. I'd imagine a similar thing there with the 5'1" Barbados Joe Walcott back in the day, who were, and all of these guys, they were accustomed to fighting bigger individuals just in general. So Barbados Joe, he could knock out heavyweights. He knocked out Joe Kowinski. It was a body shot, as a matter of fact. But that being said, Kowinski, 6'1", 6'1", you could say. I guess you probably see some listings of between 5'11", 6'1", somewhere in there. But you get the picture right there. Kowinski is one of the great fighters that the sport has seen, a true tactician, light heavyweight fame as well as heavyweight fame. Knocked out Jack Johnson, so he had power to him there. But just think about that. Joe Kowinski was knocked out by Barbados Joe Walcott, who's 5'1". But I say all that to say, but in George Godfrey's gym, George Byers and Barbados Walcott, they went at it. And from what I read, the indications, this was the real deal right here. And it was noted that Byers pretty much gave Barbados Joe a shellacking. He gave him a shellacking, and bloodied him up and was really rough and tumble. And if you've been around the actual sport and of situations like that, not that it should happen and not that it always happens, but sometimes, things can get testy in there when you're sparring even, or in situations where it's like individuals, hey, sometimes they may know each other. That doesn't mean they're necessarily like friends or buddies or anything like that. It gets cordial, even if they are friends or buddies. When you're in there, it's competition. Hey, this is how you apply your trade. This is how you work. This is how you make your money and everything. So you got to work on what you work on. Now, quality sparring is the way to go. That is the motive there. Shout out to Coach Ernesto Hillcrest Boxing over there. That's what it's. Hey, it's quality over quantity, baby. I tell you that. And that's what it's about over there at Hillcrest, quality sparring. But this right here, I don't think it was actually sparring from what I recall when I read it. Actually, it was actually them two kind of just going at it. Kind of one of those back end, probably had some bets on the side or whatever, one of those type fights. I don't recall how many rounds or whatever, but it was George Budge Byers who came out on top, who ended up being the one who gave it to Barbados Joe Walcott. What I don't recall at the time, and I may mention in the video, is whether Barbados Joe was the world welterweight champion at the time. He may or may not have been. That I don't recall, but very interesting. Check out the video. It's on the channel. George Budge Byers. Actually, looking at the community post. I just posted it yesterday. I think you'll enjoy it. It really dives into his career. Speaks about the bog. It speaks about his upbringing. Speaks about some of those fights. But just think about that. Now, what I will say is both of these guys were accustomed to fighting bigger men. And Byers, he's taller, of course, because pretty much the majority of who Barbados ran into, they were the majority of individuals that were taller than him. But that being said, Byers, I guess you could say a little bit bigger from the perspective of Byers competing more as a middleweight. Walcott competed as a welterweight, a little bit lighter at times, but he was a stocky welterweight. It wasn't like he was a skinny welterweight. Even at 5'1", he was a stocky individual. And matter of fact, let me see if I have an actual banner made of him. Just for those that can see there, there goes Barbados Joe, one of the pictures that is out there of him, 5'1". Look at that record there, 87, 24, 24. You had 19 no decisions, 3 no contests, 57 knockouts. In those 87 victories, 50 official victories, the no decision bouts, 57 knockouts. So he could punch. Don't get it twisted. 5'1", but he could actually punch. And look at those names on there. Hold on. Let me pull that again. Pull that up again. Look at those names: Joe Gans, Tommy West, Billy Smith, Bobby Dobbs, Dan Creedon, Jack Bunner, Peter Jackson, Honey Melody. Just look at those names. It's insane. Joe Gans, former world lightweight champion. Tommy West, he was a world title challenger. Mysterious Billy Smith, 2-time world welterweight champion. Bobby Dobbs, he could have challenged for a title and never did, of course, but one of the best boxers that was during that period and era. Dan Creedon, he actually competed for the world welterweight title against Tommy Ryan. I could go on. It's just a matter of, man, these were like insane. This was insane level of skill and the same level of toughness that was associated with these opponents, that type thing. So just think about the fact that George Byers was able to give it to Give it to freaking Barbados Joe Walcott, one of the toughest the sport has seen. He broke his hand in a fight, broke his hand or arm in a fight with Frank Childs, this being Barbados Joe Walcott, of course, a common opponent there of Byers. Dan mentions Barbados had the connections, both great world title shots early. Never won Colored World title. He got beat in his one shot. Oh, yes, no doubt about it. So, yeah, he was able to get that world welterweight title. Great fighter, of course, extremely tough. No doubt about it. Dan knows. Dan, the man right there. He knows that is the case right there. He does know. It's one of those situations for sure. So George was in with him real quick. Let me pull this banner up again of George Byers, just so we can see some of those opponents. Dick Moore, you got to look him up, really. Fighting Dick Moore. There've been a lot of fighting individuals out there, but he was in with a who's who, a slew of the best fighters in this era. I can't remember if he fought for a world title. Certainly capable. I just don't recall if he actually fought for one. Then you think of the likes of, some of the other names that are there, but Dick Moore, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. If you don't know Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, former world light heavyweight champion, one of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport. Now, this is jumping between sort of time frames. Let me see. When did he fight Philadelphia Jack? So he fought Philadelphia Jack in 1903. So at the time, over 100 fights for Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. So, I should note that George Byers, he didn't have a long and extensive career, as a matter of fact. So his first official fight, 1895, and his last official fight, 1904. So just under 10 years there. You think that 1895, 1904. So just under 10 years. So he didn't have a long career. I do want to note that. So the fact that he was able to get in the work that he was able to get in with the individuals that he was able to do so with in a 9-year career, hey, that's pretty impressive right there. So Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, as mentioned, this isn't taken into account. Like, I'm not going in a specific order in terms of the time frame, but Jack O'Brien, world light heavyweight champion. So this goes to show you. So George Byers, he would rise in weight. He did rise in weight, and that's how he ended up, of course, being in there with Philadelphia Jack. Now, this was a 6-rounder newspaper decision. Now, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, he did have a ton of 6-rounders. So he fought a lot of 6-round fights. And you understand it when you know that Philadelphia Jack, he was one of those individuals who had a ton of fights, hundreds of fights. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure he might have been over that 200 marker or close to that 200 marker. And then when you take into account some of the oddities, some of the things that we know, he likely had more than what's recorded there, because that was often the case with a lot of these guys there. But I'm pretty sure Philadelphia Jack, yeah, he's up there in that 200 range in terms of total fights. He might be over 200. I just don't recall. Yeah, as Dan mentioned, who didn't Philly Jack fight? Yeah, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, one of those guys who would fight pretty much anyone. And Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, he even fought at heavyweight. He fought for the world heavyweight title against Tommy Burns, the little giant from Hanover there. And in that fight, there's a little bit of footage out there. I don't know if it's the entire fight. I got to look back. But there is footage out there of that contest between Philadelphia Jack O'Brien and Tommy Burns. And Tommy Burns, believe it or not, hey, he was a pretty solid heavyweight and a puncher. He was a puncher, given his size, the smallest heavyweight in history, smallest heavyweight world champion in history, at least one who was recorded and credited with the world heavyweight title. He's the smallest at 5'7", but he was a puncher, and he was a guy who was pretty aggressive, and he'd be on the front foot in there. So when you think punchers, oftentimes you find a lot of them, they are on the front foot. And he was one of those guys for sure, an aggressive fighter, a traveling heavyweight at that. So he would travel to other countries fighting their top heavyweight, whether that be France, Australia. And he's got some pretty good knockouts out there. So in the contest with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Philadelphia Jack, he took a more tactical approach. He didn't want to get into those exchanges, of course, because of he could be caught. And if he were caught, then that would mean that, hey, there's a chance he could have been taken out there with old Tommy. But Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, like I said, he also fought at middleweight. So Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, I haven't done a video on him specifically chronicling his career individually, but there are videos on the channel where you'll see that he fought a number of guys. And yeah, it's like a who's who. His resume is stacked. And that's fighters of fighters from all walks of life, I guess you can say. And yeah, so it could be anyone from Sam Langford to freaking I mentioned Tommy Burns, Sam Langford, Tommy Burns, freaking man, he was in with everybody. Philadelphia freaking Jack O'Brien, hell of a fighter right there too. So he had skills. And also Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, for those that don't know, if you followed it, I'm sure you know, but when you think about that video of Harry Greb that is out there, that newsreel footage, which is the only video we have of Harry Greb in some form of action right there, that newsreel footage from prior to that fight with Mickey Walker, when he's doing that sort of mock sparring, he was actually doing that with an older version of course, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, who was working with him at that particular period. So that's a little nugget there for those that didn't know, but I'm sure some might have known. But you see Philadelphia Jack there working with Harry Greb, and that would have been 1920-something, because that Walker fight, that was like 24, 25, something like, or 23, 24, 25, somewhere within those 3 years there. And Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, and they're working with freaking Harry Greb. Just think about that. But he was in with everybody, man. I'm telling you, everybody. Tommy Ryan, he fought him. I was trying to think of that. So Philadelphia Jack, he was good from middleweight on up. Real talk. Dan mentioned Philly Jack, maybe the most underrated ever. Certainly, he ranks up there. He ranks up there without a doubt. There, my man Dan, Frank Childs, no doubt a monster right there. The crafty Texans. Salute to Josh Taylor in the mix here. Appreciate you, Josh Taylor in the mix here. Shout out to Josh, hey, from the family lineage of Bud Taylor, Charles Bud Taylor right there. Amazing fighter for sure. So I appreciate you dropping in, Josh. It's always great to have you in the mix there, buddy. So Dan mentioned Philadelphia Jack fought Burns 3 times, beat Burns the first time, and had a draw against Burns for the heavyweight title. Okay, good to go. Philly also had a draw against Jack Johnson for heavyweight title. Okay, good to go there. Yeah, so Burns 3 times. Okay. So some of that would have been, even at some lower weights there. So that's what's up right there. Good stuff, Dan. I told you, Dan knows his ish. So good for sharing this. So that tells you something right there. So Philadelphia Jack, man, hell of a fighter right there. Crazy resume. Crazy amount of fights, too. Jack looks good against Greb. He was an old man at the time and died not long later. Okay, good stuff there. Sharing that there, Dan. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, he still looked pretty good. Still looked to be in pretty solid shape there, given a time frame. So like this was the 20s right there, and yeah, man, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, he was one of those guys. And when you're that type of fighter, when you've been in there with pretty much everyone, then you've pretty much seen nearly every style that is out there and available to be seen from a boxing standpoint. So Philadelphia Jack O'Brien is one of those guys who was in there with such a multitude of different types and styles of fighters that he pretty much saw nearly every conceivable style that one could fathom was available. And contrary to whatever belief may be out there, hey, those guys back then, they were very much skilled. So mentioned him, Big Sandy Ferguson. He is one who was a contender there at heavyweight. I would say he was a contending fellow, big guy. I want to say he was around 6'3"ish, 200 plus pounds, and hey, guy, he can have a mean streak. I think he's had a couple of disqualifications on his record there. There's a random thing where I forget which video, maybe the Tommy Ryan video or could be the Harry Lewis. I can't remember, but I mentioned it in one of the videos that I've done on the channel just to give you an idea, an indication of old Sandy. where he got into a fight with the manager of, I believe it's the Philadelphia Flyers hockey team, and someone else. Big Sandy got into a fight ringside while watching the fight of, I forget who was competing at the time, but it's in one of the videos that's on the channel. If I think about it, I'll definitely mention it, and I'll have to look back through. But that just shows you Big Sandy, interesting dude. But Big Sandy, he was in with a number of the top tier heavyweights from the era, in and around the era there. One of those guys who was just one of the guys, hey, if you're going to be that guy, you're going to reach that next level at heavyweight, this is a guy you should beat right here. Big Sandy Ferguson. Not that Big Sandy couldn't get it done on any given day, because you know what, all it takes is a punch there on the heavyweight side. But that being said, Big Sandy was one of those individuals who, yeah, you just had to watch him on, or you just had to take note that on any given day, he could put in that work and get it done. But generally, if you were a heavyweight that was looking to do some things, then you were likely gonna surpass or beat Big Sandy Ferguson. But he is someone that is worth mentioning there. But you have to look him up, look at his resume. He's in with a who's who there in the heavyweight division around that time frame. Not a very skilled guy, big guy who could pack a little punch. But that being said, usually someone that you could beat if you're ready for that next level. Billy Stiff, similar, but more so in the middleweightish range there. Billy Stiff, he was in with a number of guys, so many, and sometimes, like I tell you, when I'm just thinking of this off top, these guys have been in with so many fighters. When you're talking hundreds of fights and things of that nature, it's hard to pinpoint who, especially when you're just thinking back. But Billy Stiff was in with a number of guys. He was known to be one of those rugged fighters, a tough guy who was just generally all around, just had all around skill, I guess you can say. And hey, depending on the day, he could get a victory over you. And he has a pretty good resume. I can't remember if he actually fought for a world title. He might have fought for some smaller level titles. Can't remember if he fought for a world title, but he has fought those that were world champions at that world champion level. But Billy Stiff, he's a guy you really have to kind of look into him to kind of get an understanding of how he was as a fighter. But look at his resume. I'm telling you, pull his resume up, you'll see what I'm talking about. He was in there with crazy amount of names. George Gardner, I mean, he needs not too much explaining right there, because he was in with, or he was the second world light heavyweight champion. The second, the first being Jack Root, who just so happens to be on the resume of George Byers as well, which is pretty crazy when you think about it, that he was in and competing with both of them. Let me see here. I'm actually going to pull up the George Byers vid, 86 boxing, because I got to step away for a quick second. And in the midst of such, I will let this George Byers video play. But hey, for those that are here now, I appreciate you. Thank you for sticking with us here as we're in the mix. I'm going to pull this up real quick, but I will be right back here in the mix once I get stitched up. But I want to show you this right here in the meantime. Stay George tuned. Budge Frederick Byers was born on June 25th, 1872 in Charlottetown, Queens, Prince Edward Island, Canada. Byers came up in the Bog, a Canadian slum that was crime-ridden, disease-infested, plagued by rampant drug use, alcoholism, and constant, often deadly violence. Some of the hardest fighters in history came from the hardest circumstances. Much like former Colored World Heavyweight Champion George Godfrey before him, it would be the sport of boxing that lifted Byers from his circumstances as he moved to Boston, Massachusetts at the age of 16, putting his chances of survival solely on himself. At 5'8.5" and weighing around 150 pounds for his career, Byers would not only be a stalwart of the middleweight division, but would even rise to the heavyweight ranks, as there was no challenge deemed too risky for Byers. His work on the docks allowed him to develop a physique marveled at by all who came across him. This mentality allowed him to reign as the Colored World Heavyweight Champion and Colored World Middleweight Champion. Much like fighters of his ilk, getting to that point wasn't easy. Byers was a skilled tactician in the ring and could go the distance even under heavy fire due to his peak physical condition and endurance. Byers also competed as a wrestler before boxing, which helped groom him to fight in the trenches in the ring. Byers was also noted for his handsome looks and dapper dress, as he was always pristinely groomed and wore the finest fabrics available, a true hallmark for a fighter of color during those days. Additionally, while in Boston, Byers was trained for 2 years by former Colored World Heavyweight Champion Old Chocolate George Godfrey, a fighter who made a name in the sport at heavyweight and was a threat to the first World Heavyweight Champion, the Boston Strongboy John L. Sullivan. Godfrey would help to mold Byers into a defensive fighter with excellent balance and stamina. The nickname Budge came about due to his opponent's inability to move or knock him off balance in the ring. In order to secure high-profile big... All right. Back in the mix here. Thank you. Appreciate you waiting there. Hey, when duty calls, as they say, duty calls. So that was the case there. So let me get back to my main screen here. Oh, no. Oh, let me take that off right there. Hold on. I'm right here in the mix, folks. Let me get back there. All right. Or, no. Hold on. How did I get there? Oh, here we go right here. All right. Thank you. So, yeah. So you heard, you saw a little bit of that there. Man, that's an interesting video. Good video. I got to look back on it myself there. That's how I got that nickname Budge, from the inability of his opponents to really move or budge him there in the ring. You know what I'm saying? So that's saying something for sure. That is saying something. Budge, hey, always working on something. He was in top tier shape. If you see him, you can see there's not many pictures of him out there. There's also a picture out there. I know it's in the video. There's a picture out there of Byers where he suited and booted up. But he was a guy who came dressed to impress in the finest of suits. That's what he was known for, rocking these 3-piece suits, all that good stuff. And pretty dapper of an individual there, but always in tip-top shape. And that, no doubt, came about from his cousin, George Godfrey, because Godfrey was another guy who was always in tip-top shape. It was a similar case to kind of how Dan the Man, who I mentioned there, Dan the Man there, he shared this oftentimes. You think about a guy like Rocky Marciano, he wasn't a huge heavyweight from a weight perspective or whatever, but he came in there in tip-top shape, yes, because he worked out in what's the name? Freaking my guy, Random History Thoughts. He's mentioned this as well. They boiled down, dropped that excess water weight and all that stuff. So they came in ripped, right, and ready. So that's the kind of guy that George Byers was. That's the kind of guy that Rocky Marciano was. That's the kind of guy that George Godfrey were. They were in just supreme shape in terms of any of the excess fat or whatever that was just gone. They were just there, ripped, ready to go, ready to shred, and they could put in work for a long period of time right there. So that's one of the things. And these guys, they were often fighting in a weight where they were underweight from the perspective of what the limit was. But that being said, they were able to deal with it because they were in enough shape that they could deal with the punishment that was coming. They could deal with the intensity. They could deal with the attrition-related aspects of said weight because they were in that tip-top shape that allowed for them to be able to compete over the duration of the contest for long periods and still maintain that stamina, still maintain that level of shape, that level of intensity, veracity, and then the mentality coupled with that, that made them a formidable force. So that's why guys like Rocky Marciano were so tough to defeat. George Byers, a tough guy to defeat because of that. Same with George Godfrey. George Godfrey, he took some losses there. He lost to Peter Jackson, the Black Prince. And Black Prince was bigger, 6'2", 200 plus right there. But Byers was, or Godfrey rather, was in there with him, giving it to him as best he could right there. Then eventually he was taken out. He was stopped. But that being said, it wasn't from him giving hell to due to the fact that, or just know that he was giving hell to the Black Prince Peter Jackson over the period of that, or the duration of that contest. So these are the types of individuals that Godfrey, Byers, I mentioned Rocky Marciano. There have been others who have been of a similar vein as well. Just these guys, they just get into that shape. They're able to do what they do, or do what they need to do right there in terms of just being able to withstand what you're bringing to them for as long as they can or whatever. So you're gonna have to throw the kitchen sink at them for the most part. So I mentioned George Gardner, Harry Peppers. We did talk about him a little bit earlier. Harry Peppers, Pacific West Coast champion. So he at middleweight, that is. So he's a guy of note there. So Jack Sullivan, I mentioned him briefly, but Jack Sullivan, a hell of a fighter, had a ton of fights. He was probably in that 200 fight range, somewhere around there. He was the brother of former world welterweight champion Mike Twin Sullivan. So they went by Twin as the nickname. So you had Jack Twin Sullivan, who Byers went up against, and Mike Twin Sullivan. And these were two damn good fighters, great fighters right there. Talking about world champion. Jack was capable of that. He was in with, as a matter of fact, Jack Twin Sullivan, he had more fights than his brother Mike. And he probably had nearly double the amount of fights that his brother had. So he and Byers fought to a draw, but Jack Twin Sullivan, one of those guys capable of being a world champion. He was in with a who's who. You look at his resume. He was a good all-around fighter. You know what I'm saying? Didn't have that pop necessarily, but that being said, his brother didn't have pop like that either. But both of them very much capable fighters right there. I don't think any relation to John L. Sullivan, interestingly enough, right there. So Dick O'Brien, one of those guys who was in with some of the best in the history of the sport and that time frame. I'm going to actually, because I can't remember, because I'm telling you, Dick O'Brien, he's come up in so many videos. I'm going to pull up his box rec just to give you an indication of old fighting Dick O'Brien, just how some of the names he was in with. So he's listed as having 81 official bouts. I'm going to give you some of the names, just a few of the names that he was in with. And this guy, you think some of these guys were fighting in the 1800s? Freaking, I'm going to give you a few names that old Dick was in with. Barbados, Joe Walcott, Dick O'Brien was in there with him. And what was the outcome of that? Because I'm looking at his box right now. This is to just show you the level of competition he was in with. So he lost him to the point, but he was in with Mysterious Billy Smith, Ed Benny. I did a video on him recently. He was a colored middleweight champion. I think he was the second ever. Bobby Dobbs, Charles Kidd McCoy. This is he was in with Dick Moore. Remember I mentioned fighting Dick Moore? He's another one. I can pull up his resume just to show you. Dan Creedon. He fought somebody. Got Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, Tommy Ryan, Jack Bonner, Jack Burke. Oh, not that Jack Burke. So disregard that one. Byers, of course, George LaBlanche, Jack Root. I'm just giving you names off Sandy Ferguson. So, hey, Marvin Hart. Hey, you know what? I'll just stop there because it's insane. It's insane to think that a guy, Dick O'Brien, who's generally, you probably associated with the middleweight ranks, if we were looking at it from today's perspective, he was in with that level of competition, those types of fighters, you know what I'm saying? It's just insane to even think about. So it was so different. That's why I say those guys back then, they were different, you know what I'm saying? They were just different. Shout out to Udis. Hey, appreciate you being in here, buddy. Udis Fernandez, always dropping through, showing some love there. Appreciate you there, buddy. Hey, always into the boxing history. Be sure to go check him out, folks. There, always good to have you. We're talking George Budge Byers. I was just mentioning because I was showing some of the names that he was in with, and I wanted to show that Dick O'Brien was one of these guys that is the name that he adds 90% of boxing. I would say 98%. No, I'm going to say 99%. Probably 99.9% of boxing fans. Have you ever heard of Dick O'Brien? They wouldn't know who he is. But I'm telling you, this dude was a hell of a fighter here. And he's another name on the resume. Mysterious Billy Smith. I talked about him a little bit last night. Multi-time world welterweight champion. Don't let the record fool you. He can be very erratic at times. I did a video on him recently, as well as there's also an older video out there. Those using AI voice, not me talking. But that being said, Mysterious Billy Smith is in with a who's who of the greatest fighters that you've ever seen in the history of the sport. Multi-time world welterweight champion. He was in there with the likes of Tommy Ryan, Jack Blackburn, you name it. But yeah, Mysterious Billy Smith, I'm sure he was in there with Jack. One of the greatest that the sport has seen. Get it says, how can we miss the history? I appreciate you there, buddy. Hey, no, I appreciate you. Hey, it's us learning, diving into this together, you know what I'm saying? And it keeps it fresh for all of us, as we know, you know, because there's so many athletes that have crossed this sport. There's so many athletes and so many fights take place. Just you look at it globally, they're happening all the time. And some of these guys and gals have gotten lost over the course of history. So we're trying to bring it. Hey, we're trying to bring them to light here. You know what I'm saying? We're trying to show them some love. Excuse me, right there for sure. So, hey, appreciate you being here, buddy. Hey, always in here showing some love there for sure. So we're talking George Budge Byers. So Mysterious Billy Smith, Frank Charles. He is a former world colored heavyweight champion, the first to lose and regain the title there. So multi-time colored world heavyweight champion there. He's been in with nearly everybody. When you think about it, from I believe he's in with C.C. Smith. I could be off to C.C. Smith, but for sure, Barbados Joe Walcott. Of course, we got George Budge Byers here. Denver Ed Martin, the likes of him. You got Jack Johnson, Frank Charles, the crafty Texan. He stood about 5'9", but he was probably be in that kind of 190 range. And just think about that, 5'9", 190. So not a big, in terms of height, heavyweight or tall guy, but it's just a kind of stocky guy who was nicknamed was the crafty Texan. I think there is reported that he is probably from Chicago, or at least he may have been born in Chicago, resided in Texas, or born in Texas, resided in Chicago. One of the two. I could be a little bit off with that. But that being said, the crafty Texan, he was known for his skill set. He could get in there and mix it up. And he was a stocky guy. So not a one-punch knockout artist in the sense of, you think about a guy who just see there just bludgeoning guys like George Foreman or something like that. But he could get it done right there. And he could caused a lot of trouble for these bigger heavyweights that he was dealing with at 5'9" in the heavyweight division. Just even here in this particular time, that is not very tall, just from overall perspective relative to the heavyweight division. So you have to have a specialness to you in some sense to be able to deal with what comes about from sort of operating in that area in a sense there. So the crafty Texan, he was in with a who's who, some of the best, as I've mentioned, over the course of this period. Multi-time colored world heavyweight champion. Stylistically, he was a guy who could box, very clever, very crafty. And he had, I guess you could say, decent speed for that particular period. But I think it was more so about his skill set, his craftiness. There are a few pictures out there, no video of him in action, but he could get it done. He could get it done, believe it. Josh Spencer, Charles Bud Taylor fought a legend, Tony Canzoneri. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Tony Canzoneri. Yeah, one of the best ever. Charles Bud Taylor. Hey, one of the best ever. I've got to dive into it more there. Josh, maybe I can do a live Charles Bud Taylor, but I want to do it right. You know what I'm saying? I want to go about it right. Because I give you all, I try to go about it from some of the guys I know more in detail. And oftentimes, I'm just coming off top, though I'd rather, but though, there's something to the other aspect of it too, some of the prepared things. So it's just when you're reading a lot of stuff, you kind of just remember some of the stuff in the mix there. I know of Charles Taylor, but I want to dive into him a bit more there. And make sure I come correct to give him his proper due. One of the greatest of all time there, Charles Bud Taylor, one of the greatest of all time from that family lineage there of Josh Taylor. So appreciate you there, buddy. Dan mentions Frank Childs dominated the great Armstrong. Yeah, Bob Armstrong, former Colored World Heavyweight Champion right there. Yeah, Frank Childs was able to dominate him. Think about it, 5'9" Frank Childs, Bob Armstrong, 6'3", 6'4". So he was in that 6'3", 6'4" range, 200 pounds. And Frank Childs was able to dominate him. Might have stopped him, if I'm not mistaken, there as well there, Dan. So that just goes to show you that Frank Childs, he was a tough one to deal with there for sure. Jack Blackburn trained Bud. Oh, yeah, that was noted there. Charles Bud Taylor for sure. Much respect. If you want a little help, I'll see what I can do. Okay, let's do it there. Let's do it there, Josh. Let's do it for sure. So let's make it happen there, buddy. I'm down for it 1,000%. Let's make it happen. So, yeah, we got to talk about Charles Bud Taylor because there are not too many talking about him that are out there. I remember I first heard about him through the Boxing Librarian. I know he's done something on him at some point over the course of time. That's when I first became aware of him, as a matter of fact. Hey, he needs his due. He needs his due there, Josh. So let's do it. Let's set something up there for sure there, buddy. I'm down for it. Let's see here. We're talking George Budge Byers. Mentioned Frank Childs, mentioned Jack Root. If you don't know Jack Root, first world light heavyweight champion. Now there was a tournament conducted. He just so happened to be the winner of such. He was a darn good fighter there, competed at heavyweight as well. I'm trying to remember stylistically how it was. I don't really recall, but he was a solidly built guy. You know, he had decent size there for the weight, and he was one of those individuals. He had a pretty good resume, believe it or not. As a matter of fact, I think he actually fought. I want to say he might have fought Marvin Hart at heavyweight or something for some version of the heavyweight title in the immediate aftermath. I think that's what it was. In the immediate aftermath of James J. Jeffries retiring. Somehow, I guess he was able to set up who could fight for the heavyweight title or something like that. But it wasn't unheard of because Joe Gans, when he had quote unquote retired, essentially he gave his title to George Mesmick, aka Young Jimmy Burns, or Jimmy Burns, rather, who was a protege of Tommy Burns, but is George Mesmick. He regarded him as the lightweight champion. So it's not unheard of, but there was something similar, though it became official. It wasn't necessarily official with Mesmick and Gans, and it's sort of passing over of that title to him or handing over that title. But when it came to that match that was set up, I believe it was Hart and Root. Correct me if I'm wrong, certainly, folks. I believe they fought there when Marvin Hart became world heavyweight champion. He beat Jack Root. We ended up moving up to that weight. So Jack Root, he was a guy who, as mentioned, world light heavyweight champion, fought for that heavyweight title. Decent fighter from an overall perspective, certainly a place there in the history of the sport. Now, that tournament for the light heavyweight championship, Sam Langford wasn't able to compete. Now, he would have likely won that tournament and would have been that first or inaugural world light heavyweight champion. By that same token, also would have favored Joe Kowinski, who wasn't competing in that tournament. And Kowinski, like George Byers, I think Kowinski's career was probably about 9 years, something like that. Had a decent amount of fights. They might have had around the same amount of fights. Maybe Kowinski had a little bit more, but I think he was the one who was capable of and could have been world light heavyweight champion. But Jack Root, damn good fighter, just from an overall perspective. Then, of course, lastly there, at least on this listing, Jack Bunner, who I mentioned. Man, Jack Bunner's been in with so many freaking people. I can't tell you because then, I even start to confuse myself with. So some of these guys, when I see the names, I got to be honest with you. I just think like, damn, they were in with so many people. I don't want to give them credit for people that they weren't in with, just with me just kind of thinking off the top of my head, just in knowing who they are, knowing how they competed, the era, and who they and generally who they're in with. So I tell myself that I don't want to give them credit for individuals that they didn't fight. So that has me kind of thrown off. I'm like, damn. But Jack Bunner, he was in with pretty much everybody. And I know that's a broad thing to say, but literally he was in with freaking everybody. Jack Bunner, a heavyweight who, if he fought today, maybe more light heavyweight, cruiserweight, you know what I'm saying? But more so light heavyweight, between light heavyweight and cruiserweight, because he wasn't a huge guy necessarily. And I believe he came up from probably middleweight, somewhere around that range right there. But Jack Bunner, man, hell of a fighter right there. And he was one of those guys, what I recall reading on him, just from a stylistic standpoint, a guy that just kept coming forward. You know what I'm saying? He had some skill set to him. That being said, he's a guy that just kept coming, throwing a lot of punches. You just had to deal with them, you know what it is, and he was in with so many different people. I've done a number of videos on the channel. I'm sure you can just throw a name out there, and he was probably in with them. I was trying to think of some individuals that he was in with, but I've done a number of them on the channel. He's been with everybody, man. I can't even think of who he's in with because he was in with so many people. But Jack Bunner, one of the great heavyweights, or even lower around that time frame, who was fighting that particular period. And my bad. I actually hit the wrong button. But what I was about to say was the best way to kind of sum up these guys and look at these guys, because it's so, realistically speaking, it's tough to put them into perspective and context with a modern fighter, because the conditions are so different just from an overall perspective in the sport, whether that's from rounds, the safety, some of the rule sets and all of that stuff. But what you have to do then is you kind of look at the resume, who they were in with, and some of the particulars surrounding some of those fights. So we're talking 20 plus rounders or something like that, 15 to 20 plus rounders, some even far beyond that. As we know, you have fights getting in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70 round range. It's not uncommon. It's not unheard of. This is under the Marquis of Queensberry rules, which makes it even that more insane. So that means 3-minute rounds. Does that mean there's sustained action for every round? No, there's not. But it's not London prize ring rules. It's not those bare knuckle rules. London prize ring, where you go down and, of course, that constitutes the end of the round. No, these were gloves competition, and sometimes in 3-4 ounce gloves or less on some occasions, where you were fighting 3-minute rounds under the Marquis of Queensberry rules for 70 plus freaking rounds. Dan Creedon, Tommy Ryan, that's where Dan Creedon stands out. They had a 4-6 rounder somewhere in there, 74 or 76 rounds, one of the two. And these are 3-minute freaking rounds. You're talking multi-hour fights where they're just in the ring, kind of just going at it. A lot of blood loss, a lot of scars, abrasions, etc., bruises, bumps, whatever you want to call it. So it's hard. But Jack Bunner, he's a guy, I could say I had to look back to see who all he was. Matter of fact, let me pull up Jack Bunner. Matter of fact, because I need to do that, and now I can tell you who he's in. He's in some videos on the channel there, but he was in with everybody. He would fight anyone too, regardless of color, whatever you want to call it. He was in. I'm not even going to go back to his early career. He was in there with Dick Moore, of course, fighting Dick Moore, Australian Billy Smith, decent fighter right there. Joe Butler. So you'll see him in the Joe Butler video. That's one I was thinking of. I had that in mind. So Joe Butler, I had it on the video. Harry Peppers, Mysterious Billy Smith, Tommy West, damn good fighter. Want to do a video on him. You're talking about that particular era. One of the best fighters we've seen in some tough fights. He fought Tommy Ryan, Tommy West, that is. Just so happens Jack Bonner did too. Jack Bonner, insane. insane. I'm going to go up. Charlie McKeever, Barbados Joe Walcott, Charles Kidd McCoy. It's too many. I'm telling you. Young Peter Jackson. He has a resume that is absolutely insane. We just think about some of the individuals that he was in with. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Jack Blackburn. I'm going to do a video on him because I just feel like it's overdue and people should know about Jack Bunner. They should know about him. Hold up real quick. Let me see. Shout out to my man there, Historical Boxing Society. Salute to you there, buddy. Byers certainly lived longer than most of his era, 64 years old. Died in 1937. He got to see a lot of fighters. Indeed there. Hey, go check out Historical Boxing Society, folks. Hey, HBS, I go and check you out here and there myself. Matter of fact, I'm probably going to check out some of your stuff a little bit later here tonight there because, hey, I'm always listening. I go to sleep to boxing history at times, and Historical Boxing Society, I can say, hey, he touches on some of these fighters from yesteryear, some of these eras here that I even speak on. Some of these fighters who were fighting in the 1800s, who these days don't get much, if any, mention at all. Historical Boxing Society. Go check out his channel, folks. I recommend it. I highly recommend it. I need to share it. I'm going to share it there on my profile because I mean it that much there with Historical Boxing Society. He does touch on some of those crazy stories, crazy fights that are out there. And we've had some dialogue in the comments and all this stuff. So I appreciate you dropping by here, buddy. I do appreciate it. I'm going to share it there on my profile. Go check him out, folks. He touches on some of these more obscure fighters. Jack Bonner, for instance, one of those who can be considered. But I was just reading some of the names he was in. But aggressive style guy that came forward, threw a lot of punches, and man, he got it done. He wasn't a huge guy. I believe he was like 5'9"-ish or something like 5'9", 5'10". But that being said, he was able to get it done. So he's another one there. George Budge Byers was in. So I think that when you're looking at any of these historic fighters contextually, one way to kind of look at what they were able to do and accomplish and to put things into perspective is to look at kind of some of the individuals they were in with, what those individuals were able to do, who those individuals were in with, and that gives you some context. So think of it like a lot of these guys, think of the great Manny Pacquiao here in modern times. You think of the amount of weights he scaled, and of course it's a multi-belt era, but he scaled multiple weights, right? And he was just in with such a variety of fighters who are some of the greatest across their weights that it just stands out when you look at it from a resume perspective. And that's one of the things that you see when you look at some of these old fighters from these periods there, late 1800s, early 1900s, when they were competing in those eras. Some of these guys, you might not know their names or the names of all of those listed on their resume, but as you started diving into their resumes and start looking at some of those names, you'll run across the likes of some Dick Moores, you'll run across some Dick O'Briens, who I was just speaking of. Run across the likes of Willie Lewis, another guy who I want to do a video on, who never won a world title, competed for one, but just one of these great fighters from that period. For some reason, their name kind of got lost in the shuffle there. So these are like Manny Pacquiao. He was in with some of those type of individuals there. They're some of the best in their division. Some of them won titles, some didn't. But I just use him for example there because it's not all about titles at times, especially in those eras where you only had one belt to compete for per weight class, and of course less weight classes than what we see today. Now it's 18 or something like 17, 18 or whatever. So back then, yeah, that wasn't the case there. So you just think about that. You start to look at some of these names like, oh my goodness, he was in with who? He was in with, wow, think about Jack Blackburn, just like being in with individuals like that who didn't get a shot at a world title. But that being said, they beat world champion Jack Blackburn. He beat Joe Gans. You know what I'm saying? Just think about that. That's the type of stuff, that's the type of variety you get in looking at some of these historic fighters. And I think that if we look at it from a modern lens, we'll go back and appreciate some of these modern fighters even more as time goes on for what they were able to do, even if they didn't win a world title. Though in the multi-belt era, certainly you look at some of those that may have won one of the belts. Think about guys the likes of Buddy McGirt. You think about Randall Bailey. I did a poll with him recently there with Amir Khan, another one there. But Randall Bailey, big time puncher there who could, depending on the night who he's in with, hey, he could get it done. Kendall Holt, think about guys like that. But that's just kind of what we're pointing out in some of this historic talk. And hey, we can get deeper and dive further on certain individuals because there's a ton of information that is out there on them. But hey, the best way to dive into them, of course, is, or how I get a lot of information, was through reading newspapers. So when I'm constructing some of these videos that you see on the channel, pretty much all of them actually, it's diving through newspapers, looking at a chronicling of their fights, sometimes reading multiple articles of how this person called the fight or that person called the fight, depending on who was the editor or the writer, the person covering the newspaper, especially when you think about newspaper decisions and such. So that stuff, hey, there's a beauty to it, and there's an entertainment aspect and an enjoyment to it and all that stuff. Hey, that's what keeps us coming to the history aspect of it. So while the world may not be here, we're going to keep it going and keep these individuals remembered. So I appreciate everyone who's been in here in the mix with me, and we're going to keep this thing going for sure. So be on the lookout for what the next Wednesdays will be. I'm going to try to give my guy random acoustic thoughts. Maybe I can get him on. We can do one of the discussions that ties him in as well, but I'll let you know. But regardless, we're going to be talking boxing history every Wednesday. So thank you for all that joined in. Hey, I appreciate every single one of you. We're going to do Charles Bud Taylor one of these days here coming up as well there. So thank you to all, and hey, we'll see what the future has in store. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your week and weekend. Maybe I'll be in the mix here at some point between then. Don't know for sure, but next Monday, I'm going to be interviewing someone who spent some time with Muhammad Ali. She's not a boxing historian per se, but she spent time around the man himself right there. So we're going to get to talk to her, Kelly Riley Baldwin. So be on the lookout for that, folks. And hey, enjoy the rest of your night, as mentioned there. And I'll see you on the flip.